This is a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station.
7:36 a.m. You are listening to The Morning Run. I'm Shazana Mokhtar with Wong, Shou, Ning. For now, though, we're turning our attention to what's happening over in the U.S. So in keeping with the pledges made during his election campaign, U.S. President Donald Trump on February 1st announced sweeping tariffs of 25% on goods from Canada and Mexico, as well as 10% on goods from China. Mexico and Canada, the top two U.S. trading partners, immediately vowed retaliatory tariffs, while China said it would challenge Trump's move at the World Trade Organization and take other countermeasures.
However, literally overnight, there was an 11-hour reprieve as the tariff implementation in North America was postponed for a month after both Mexico and Canada agreed to send more troops to the border. Prior to this, the White House said that the tariffs were being implemented to pressure these three countries into stopping the flow of fentanyl and immigrants into the U.S. and would remain in place until the crisis is alleviated. Now, although the North American war has narrowly been averted for now, how will the landscape for global trade be impacted by Trump's trade policies?
To discuss the implications of this, we do have on the line with us Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, CEO of the Center for Market Education. Carmelo, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's get a little bit of context into why these tariffs were actually being imposed. U.S. President Donald Trump used the International Emergency Powers Act to impose these tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. How does this differ from previous U.S. tariff impositions?
Hi, good morning, and thanks for having me. Always a pleasure. As you have seen overnight, the situation changed quite radically. And I think here is indeed the main difference with previous similar moves on tariffs. So while what we have seen with the first Trump administration, but also later with the Biden administration, because let's not forget that also the Biden administration imposed heavy duties on China, was that in that case, the tariffs were introduced with purely economic motivations. So the attempt was really to favor domestic production over import. While in this case, as I think it has been written by the Wall Street Journal for even a couple of months ago, as we have seen, Trump is using the threat of tariffs and duties to obtain something else. So the motivation behind the measure is not strictly economic or industrial, is more on to achieve different kind of results on different planes. In this case, drug trafficking and illegal migration. So, and of course, I would add that the other big difference is that in this case we are targeting neighbor countries like Canada and Mexico with very high duties, like 25%. But indeed, the motivation behind is not purely commercial, is more on a different plane of social policy.
Okay, Carmelo, all these U-turns or flip-flopping with regards to tariffs, because the US announces something, then later it withdraws or delays. What kind of impact does this actually then have on, let's say, global trade? Does it make it very complicated?
It creates a certain sense of instability, if you want. But if we look at the reaction of the markets, I think that the markets have digested the situation and they are all betting for these tariffs, these measures indeed to be temporary and to aim at achieving something else. So at least on the Western side of the world, there is an understanding that the American administration is not purely trying to pursue a trade war, but is moving on a different action plan. And therefore, if this is globally digested, probably we may see less shocks than what we expect now.
But at the same time, we do see China also being hit with 10% tariffs on top of the pre-existing tariff regime that was launched during Trump's first presidency and added on or continued by the Biden administration. What are you watching for from China? How do you think they might respond? And can Beijing afford to up the stakes given its fragile economic growth?
I think that this situation is revealing all the weaknesses of the China development model, which is a contradictory model that has been a mix of opening to the market, but more in a strategic way rather than believing in the potential of the market. So probably also the West has been too fast in opening WTO to China when the country was not ready culturally to accept the rules of free trade. So China has developed an international aggressiveness by supporting export and production with subsidies and favorable loans. So the model that has been embraced is not a model of believing in free trade internationally, also accepting the cultural model behind free trade, not just the economic model. And so China will have to clearly think what they want to do next. They want to go back to a more centrally directed economy, or they want to make the necessary step to embrace free trade also, culturally speaking. That is the challenge ahead.
Now, do you see the ASEAN and Malaysia in particular being affected by this ongoing North American trade war in any way? Or are we going to be more impacted from the escalation in the US-China trade war, the potential tariffs that will follow?
I think here there are different considerations to be made. So one, obviously, that when a trade war is ongoing, nobody wins in the long run. So to make it short, but in the short run, there are opportunities for Southeast Asia to attract businesses that are eventually trying to escape the war, not only directly by relocating here, but also by looking at, let's say, safe harbors in the transition between the two countries. So I think in the short run, this is an opportunity for Southeast Asia.
But to what extent will Southeast Asia remain a safe harbor, right? Because the question is, are there other trade targets that the Trump administration might have in their crosshairs? Could any of this fall within ASEAN?
I think that in this regard, it is important for ASEAN countries to pursue a very aggressive policy of trade agreements, bilateral, multilateral, so to keep this situation, let's say, of harbor as much as possible shielded by the bad winds ahead. And eventually, if something bad happens with the United States, they may rely on different trading partners. And in this regard, I think is important the acceleration that has been made on the free trade agreement negotiation with the European Union.
Okay, talking about these free trade agreements, I mean, at the end of the day, it seems to encourage countries to have their own trading blocks, like what we have seen in the EU, which has signed 3 FTAs in a very short space of time. Is it at all possible, or is it just a dream? If we could, in some way, the US would slowly be excluded from global trade.
You see, if we look at this from an historical perspective, we see that usually eras of decades of relatively international free trade are somehow followed by resurgent protectionism, and then when the damage is done, then we all go back to free trade. So there is a cyclical alternance of free trade and protectionism, and probably now we are experiencing the end of an era of free trade and the emergence of a global trend toward protectionism. So I believe that free trade agreement can partially shield the negative effects of this, but in general, the international mood has changed, and probably we will have to go through it. Even the European Union, if you look at that, I mean, in the end, they imposed tariffs on EVs from China, accusing China of unfair competition. So nobody is immune from the virus, let's say.
So, Carmelo, is it inevitable as well that other countries will retaliate against any imposition of tariffs by the United States? Is that the best way, or do you just sit silently and just let the US do what they want?
I don't think that retaliation is the best way. Eventually, a good retaliation would be being more aggressive on free trade negotiation with other parts of the world. I think that is what we should do, but I don't think that's the direction where we are heading. I think that really globally there is a change of wind, and we will have to deal with it. Although, of course, it's not something I'm happy to see happening, but it is what it is.
Carmelo, thank you so much for speaking with us. That was Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, CEO at the Center for Market Education, weighing in on the implications of the Trump administration trade tariff agenda that's been put into motion and kind of paused, but no doubt is still hovering over the rest of the world. I think we'll just be watching this space in the days to come as to what could emerge. Always a surprise.
Yeah, for sure. And the tariffs here are not just an economic tool, but clearly a political one.
Stay tuned, BFM 89.9.
You have been listening to a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station. For more stories of the same kind, download the BFM app.